Well, Razorback fans, coming up is another edition of Bombastic where we talk a little baseball, and this time getting into the transfer portal class. So let's talk about on today's Locked On Razorbacks podcast.
You are Locked On Razorbacks, your daily podcast on the Arkansas Razorbacks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Razorbacks podcast, the Bombastic edition. I'm John Neighbors alongside Andrew Ellis. And Andrew, I know we talked a lot of pitching in the last Bombastic edition, and something that has really changed the game of college sports in general, of course, is the transfer portal. And, Arkansas has really had some success in that. Doesn't mean that's the only thing that they've done, but every single year you have a couple guys that transfer in Arkansas that end up being huge factors in the team's success. So how does it look this year?
Well, John, I keep thinking about, will Arkansas win a national championship? That's the question everyone wants to know. Is like, can Arkansas do it? Is this going to be the year? And you kind of start thinking, all right, what are the pieces you need? Like, what are the things that you need to have happen in order for you to compete for that national title? And in the last few years, I think the answer has been the transfer portal class. You think about LSU and the way they were able to win the national title in 2023. It was a big time transfer portal class with Skeens, Tommy White, and some of those guys. Like, that's what in Tennessee last year, we're getting a guy like Billy Amick and a few others. Like, it kind of comes down to how do you fill out your roster with some of your returns? You have to have everything. You've got to have the pitching. You've got to have some returning veterans on your team. You've probably got to have a couple freshmen contribute. But I think the transfer portal class is kind of the biggest variable that everyone kind of wonders about in the offseason. I mean, when the season rolls around, whether Arkansas wins, loses, whatever, people are immediately going to start thinking, well, who can we get in the portal next year? Who can we get in the portal this summer? And so I think there were a lot of people who were kind of interested to see what Arkansas was going to do this offseason with their transfer portal class. And if you missed, last week's show, we talked a good bit about kind of the top guys that you need to know and went position by position as some of those guys, if you need a quick refresher on this. But, in baseball, it's harder to quantify this stuff because, in football, you've got your 24/7 Sports, your Rivals, your ESPN 300, that they rank all these things. They rank every player, they rank every class. And so you kind of have a pretty good idea of where everyone stacks up. In baseball, it's a little bit, lesser. Like, there's some perfect game and there's some people that do recruiting rankings. But for transfer portal rankings, it's kind of just beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's kind of everyone just gets to argue. And a lot of times you see the big names, and that's kind of how you know how good your transfer portal class is. And so, Hog fans might look at this group and say, I've never heard of Logan Maxwell. I've never heard of Rocco Pepe. I've never heard of these guys. How can we be the best transfer portal class in the country? But I do want to give a quick shout out to 6'4 Analytics, who has become, I guess, like the go-to college baseball transfer site, at least in my opinion. I know a lot of schools around the country use it as a metric for stuff like that, but they do a good job of ranking every player in the portal for the most part and ranking the team rankings at the end of the summer. And basically every metric you want to use, Arkansas has a top 5 transfer portal class this year. And now their pitching staff is obviously a big part of it, getting 2 of the top pitchers in the entire country in Zach Root and Landon Bidelshis, which I still have not learned how to pronounce that guy's name. But yeah, according to 6'4 Analytics, Arkansas has not only the number 2 overall class, but they have the number 1 overall average ranked pitching class with those top 2 guys, like I mentioned. But there's also this weird little metric called runs created, which 6'4 Analytics does. And Arkansas apparently has the number 2 class in that regard as well. And there's all kinds of other lists on the site you guys can go check out of like top 5 slugging, top 5 whatever. But Arkansas is in the mix for all of them. And so just to kind of give everybody a quick little refresher, Arkansas has 6 of the top 40 transfers in the country, which 6 may not sound like a lot, but with 40, I mean, that's literally like 1/7 of the top transfers in the entire country. So I mentioned the 2 pitchers who were number 3 and number 5 on that list, respectively. Logan Maxwell comes in at number 27. Rocco Pepe comes in at number 29. Camden Koziel comes in at number 34, the Vanderbilt transfer. And Charles Davalon comes from FGCU. He checks in at number 40. Arkansas's also got a kid in Michael Anderson, who I feel like is flying under the radar a little bit and could be a legitimate power threat for this team. He comes in at number 161 on the list. But when you take that transfer portal class and mix it in with some of the returners that we already know of, like a Ryder Helfrich and a Nolan Souza and a Vahiva Aloy, who's obviously going to be quite the superstar, I feel like Arkansas's transfer portal class, they checked a lot of boxes they needed to check this offseason and gave themselves a really good chance to be in that mix down the stretch next year.
Yeah, one of the questions I always have, and I always kind of laugh about, is like, okay, who's going to be this year's the Caleb Cali who like is everyone's excited about? They struggle in the beginning, and then they catch on fire, like kind of like what Aloy did a little bit this past season. Like, who's going to be that guy this year? Makes me wonder.
I feel like Davalon, the center fielder, has a good chance to do that just because he's the youngest of the group. I think he's a true sophomore, and he's already getting some buzz as a draft prospect. And so I feel like by the time February rolls around, scouts will kind of be talking about him, and we'll probably be writing about him and raving about him. And oh, he's killing it in fall ball, and that's going to be the one where he'll go 2 for 12 in the opening weekend, and people will be freaking out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be that, or people saying, "Oh, they see these averages that these guys are doing from their previous spot, they're like, oh, well, it's going to go down because Nate Thompson." Yeah. Like that's just going to be the correlation that everybody's going to make. So, but we'll talk about some of the biggest X factors that are returning on the roster for the Razorbacks coming up next. So stay with us. You're on the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. All right, folks, want to remind you all that we are brought to you by Gametime. We know that during the time of sports, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, whether it's theater, whether it's concerts, comedy shows, no matter what, we got to have tickets. And there's no better place to get all your tickets than the Gametime app. They have so many different things to choose from when it comes to the benefits, like the last minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for all these events. You can also get flash deals where you can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of any game or any event. And my favorite thing, of course, being the all-in pricing, where you never have to worry about getting one price, and then when you go through a few steps, suddenly it doubles in price because there's all these little hidden fees. That's not about what Gametime does. They have the all-in pricing setting to where you can see the full price up front, no questions asked. So take the guesswork out of buying any tickets, MLB, college football, all the tickets when it comes to the Gametime app by downloading it, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, so moving on into the next segment of the Locked On Razorbacks podcast, Bombastic Edition. We talked about transfer portal, Andrew, but it's about returners too. And Arkansas, of course, again, plenty of talent there, but who are the biggest X factors for the returning guys?
Well, a lot of times when you're trying to forecast how good your team is going to be or how good a certain position group or whatever it is going to be, it's a little bit of a guessing game. But a lot of times you kind of forget about those guys on the roster who are returning. Because I think a lot of times when people are trying to forecast what does Arkansas need in the transfer portal, well, that depends. Is Ryder Helfrich going to be a legitimate catcher? Is Vahiva Aloy going to continue to be a big time shortstop? But speaking of some of those returns, I got to start with Kendall Diggs because I feel like he's maybe the most polarizing player on the roster at this point, just because of he was a fan favorite as a freshman, had a huge year as a sophomore, and was by that point a bona fide Daddy Diggs fan favorite. Then obviously he had his struggles last year. I think a lot of us were all kind of confused by those struggles. And then we find out, he was battling an injury. And it turns out that injury was way worse than we realized, which you'd think that as a fan base, we'd have a little bit more sympathy considering that we just watched Peyton Stovall go through that same ordeal and then come back the next year and have a great year and get drafted. And turns out that injury was a legitimate thing. So I think that's one of my biggest questions of the offseason for me is Kendall Diggs. What are we getting out of this guy? And you would expect when he's healthy to get a legitimate top of the order bat, a guy that's going to hit around 300, has plenty of power, can hit it to all sides of the field. So I think if Arkansas is getting that version of that guy, potentially either starting in right field, maybe DHing, maybe he ends up playing corner infield, who knows what's going to happen with him. But I think if Arkansas is getting the legit version of Kendall Diggs, it sort of changes the dynamics of how you feel about this outfield and really just the lineup overall. And he's the type of bat and the type of player who kind of affects everything. When you have a piece like that, especially if you're throwing him at the top of the lineup, when he's really locked in and taking those 9, 10, 11 pitch at bats, it can change everything. But, I mentioned Ryder Helfrich a lot, and he's, I think, if you're just talking about X factors, he might be the biggest one because he was one of the top catchers in his high school class coming into last year. He's a big reason why Arkansas had the number one transfer portal class. He didn't have a great freshman year, and that may be an understatement to some who had very high expectations, but I was going back and looking at it, John. Can you think of a freshman catcher who had success at Arkansas? Like legitimately, like any of them? I even look back. James McCann is the one that off the top of my head, I was like, I feel like he started, but he hit like 175, 180 as a freshman. He took a little bit of a time to develop. And so I really started to think about that. And I'm like, man, maybe we were a little harsh to Ryder Helfrich as a freshman, expecting him to be a star that was going to play every day and be a stud. And if his summer is any indication, we were definitely too unfair to him. I mean, the dude hit 261, which is, way higher than the 185 or 187 that he hit as a freshman. Hit 11 home runs and drove in 37 runs in 36 games. And the 36 games is notable to me because that's a pretty hefty amount. That's a pretty big sample size to be hitting that well, getting that experience playing every day. But if you extrapolate those numbers, that's a good word there. If you extrapolate those numbers, that's essentially a 20 home run season in a full college baseball season. So, I mean, that's the type of potential and that's the type of talent we're talking about here. And he's a guy that I feel like a lot of people are overlooking. Not that they don't expect him to start or don't expect him to be in the mix, but I think people are underestimating just how much of an impact he can be as a catcher and as a middle of the lineup type of bat there. And I think that experience he got in the Cape Cod League is going to be huge because Cape Cod's, outside of literally playing in the SEC, I feel like it's the best way to get that actual experience and test yourself against the best competition in the country. So to see him rise to the occasion and hit well in that league says a lot about what he can do in the SEC. And I think he's a guy that is just kind of a sleeping giant, waiting to be woken up there a little bit. And speaking of guys in the Cape Cod League solidifying themselves as stars, Vahiva Aloy did just that. I mean, he didn't play as many games as Ryder because he played every single game for Arkansas, but he played 21 games this summer, hit 8 home runs, had 24 RBI. I think there were some people, and I'll even throw myself, I was a little bit, dare I say, underwhelmed by what Vahiva Aloy did in his first year at Arkansas, his sophomore year, which is saying a lot for a guy who hit like 280 and had 15 home runs, like led the team in RBI and turned into a really good defender. But I think it tells you how talented that kid is that I'm saying I'm underwhelmed by what he did last year. I think he can take it up even another level. He pretty much did that this summer, hit over 300 in the Cape Cod League, which is notable. I think he's going to take that next step and be a legit 20 home run type of guy. I mean, you're already seeing draft lists that have him as, top 30, top 40, potential first round pick type of guy. So I think I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about what Arkansas is going to be next year, are forgetting the fact that you have a shortstop who literally might be the best player at his position in the entire country. One more returner I want to mention real quick is Reese Robinette, who, again, not a lot of fans, maybe the more casual fans might not know his name at all. Big Country is what you should know him as. Had some moments as a true freshman at Arkansas. And I remember because he came in with Jason Jones and I forget, and Mason Neville, who were like the two huge recruits of that class. But I remember going into his freshman year being like, man, this Reese Robinette kid, this Big Country kid that no one had ever heard of, he's just as good as those guys. And turns out he's the only one out of that trio left at Arkansas. He had a massive summer. So he redshirted this past year. Didn't have the offseason he wanted, didn't feel like he was going to get on the field. And they kind of made that decision to redshirt him rather than only playing him a little bit. I think he's a little bit of a sleeper as a guy who could legitimately help Arkansas at DH or first base. Now, he played in the New England League, so not the Cape Cod League. He wasn't facing, 98 miles an hour every game, but he played 37 games, hit 331, and had 9 home runs. Again, if you extrapolate those numbers, or you're talking about a guy with like 15, 20 home run type of potential. Now, will he do that at Arkansas? That's a little bit optimistic considering he was in the New England League, but I think it tells you a lot about just like what kind of talent you have at Arkansas, that a guy like that is redshirting and struggling to even get on the field. And I overlooked Nolan Souza a little bit, and I apologize to Nolan because that's my guy. I've had him on the show before, but he's another returner where if you can guarantee me that he's going to be a legitimate everyday starter who takes that next step and is a double-digit home run guy. I mean, we saw flashes. There were moments where it looked like he might be the most impactful hitter in the Arkansas lineup last year. He came back down to earth a little bit in SEC play, but if he really takes that next step and evolves into like an everyday second baseman, an everyday third baseman for Arkansas, whatever the case may be, it sort of changes my opinion on how I feel about this team overall. And then, I mean, I've listed off the transfers there, but I feel like it's a lot easier to mix and match and place those guys where you want if you feel like you're getting legitimate production from those two guys. Before I turn it back over to you, John, I just want to mention two guys because on our first show that we did, which, we recorded them on the same day, people were really upset that I did not mention Brent Iredale. who is Arkansas's top JUCO transfer, who hit 25 home runs the JUCO level last year, and he turned down some money to come to Arkansas. He's another one that I'm gonna classify as an X factor, just because with JUCO guys, you never really know what you're getting, because they all kind of face varying levels of competition. But if you think about even the last 5-6 years, even in this transfer portal era, you mentioned Caleb Cali, Arkansas's had a lot of JUCO bats come in and pick up right where they left off in JUCO and be legitimate players. I'm thinking Matt Goodhart, Jalen Battles, Brady Slavens. I mean, the list goes on. I think Brent Iredale has a good chance to be that level of a guy, which that's putting a lot on him. But I mean, he hit 25 home runs at the JUCO level last year. I feel like I gotta give him some props. And then Justin Thomas is another guy out of Florida who has a chance to work his way into that outfield mix. He's not quite as highly regarded as Iredale was as a prospect, but I think those two guys are a little bit of X factory, whereas not a lot of people are talking about them, but they could be huge factors in this lineup. And so we'll see. And the fall is always fun because you get to kind of watch the cream rise to the top. And so it's gonna be a lot of competition, but a lot to be excited about in terms of this Arkansas lineup.
So real quick, do you have, as far as just a really, really, really early prediction on who leads the team in the batting average, you think it's going to be Diggs, or you think it's going to be somebody else?
Diggs, I feel like is a good chance, especially because, I mean, when you're, I think people oftentimes overlook the MLB draft and how much it affects these kids during the season and when you're trying to play your best ball. And so I think when Kendall was banged up this past year and, struggling, not putting up the numbers he did, I think he pressed a good bit and kind of was a little bit more home run or bust than he's been in past times in his career. I think he's a guy that when he's really at his best, he's drawn a ton of walks. He's getting on base a ton. He's going the other way. He's going to hit home runs. I mean, he hit 12 as a sophomore. I don't know how many he finished with last year, but I mean, he's got plenty of power. So I wouldn't be stunned if he hits, 15 home runs next year, but I do think he's going to be a little bit more of a consistent on base guy. He draws a ton of walks, so he might not lead the team in average. Who knows? I mean, Logan Maxwell, the TCU transfer, is another guy. He, by the way, I should have mentioned, is the top-notch candidate for Nate Thompson ruined his batting average. That's going to be the narrative that everyone says, because he hit 300 as a sophomore at TCU, hit 335 last year. So if he doesn't hit over 300 at Arkansas, fans are going to go nuts. But I think he's a sneaky candidate to lead the team in average as well, because he's going to probably end up in that 310, 320 range.
Well, appreciate everybody listening in to the Locked On Razorbacks podcast, Bombastic Edition. For Andrew Ellis, I'm John Neighbors. Same sports show, same sports channel tomorrow afternoon. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. We'll see you.